The committee will come to order. We're honored to have the Honorable Sarah Sewell. She is the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the Department of State. We appreciate you being here. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn before they testify. So if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. We, again, appreciate you being here. We are pretty generous on the timing of your verbal comments. If you have additional comments and testimony, I believe, which is a bit revised from what you first gave us, that's perfectly acceptable. That's fine. In this case, we will obviously make all of your written comments part of the record, and if you want to add something after the fact, we are happy to do that as well. So we will now recognize you for 5 minutes. If you just bring that microphone maybe straight there and make sure it's on, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Tierney, although I see he's not here, but I wish him a happy birthday in absentia, and members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today to provide details on how the Obama administration is promoting religious freedom worldwide. Today's hearing couldn't come at a more appropriate time because in too many corners of the globe, religion is perverted by cynical forces as a tool of subjugation to justify violence, to expand power, and to advance parochial political agendas. There's no greater example of this terrifying reality than the metastasizing growth of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, and the terrorist group in Iraq and Syria. Countering violent extremism and promoting tolerance and human rights is a policy priority that cuts across many of the bureaus I lead as Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and indeed the entire State Department. The most basic rights of freedom and expression and thought, conscience, and religion are at the core of our work, whether we are countering terrorism or preventing atrocities. The United States government is appalled by the horrendous violence and violations of religious freedom and other rights in Iraq and Syria. As the President told the nation last Wednesday, we cannot allow these communities to be driven from their ancient homelands. President Obama recognized the alarming nature of the violence by ISIL against the Yazidi community last month, saying that ISIL has called for the systematic destruction of the entire Yazidi people, which would constitute genocide. This threat, combined with the request from the Iraqi government, prompted President Obama to authorize a humanitarian effort reinforced by targeted airstrikes to help save those trapped on Mount Sinjar. Again, in Amerli, we airdropped food and water to Shia Turkmen, and we provided air support for Iraqi forces that broke ISIL's siege and prevented a humanitarian catastrophe. Going forward, the coalition mission and our actions in Iraq will continue to help protect vulnerable communities. Mr. Chairman, our efforts to combat ISIL and ensure the long-term safety of the religious communities now so threatened in the Middle East are led by the administration's abiding commitment to advance freedom of religion and protect people at risk due to their faith. Mindful that we can never do enough, yet focused on how we can do more, this administration is seized by the pursuit of religious freedom as a central foreign policy and national security priority. In remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast this year, President Obama explained why, saying, "History shows that nations that uphold the rights of their people, including the freedom of religion, are ultimately more just and more peaceful and more successful. Nations that do not uphold these rights sow the bitter seeds of instability and violence and extremism. So freedom of religion matters to our national security." The President's commitment has been matched by that of Secretary of State John Kerry. And just last week in Baghdad, the Secretary urged the new Iraqi government to protect and integrate members of religious minorities, saying that we're committed to working with the new government as long as they're committed to diversity, to inclusivity, as long as they're going to protect minorities in Iraq. My team, including the International Religious Freedom IRF Office, has been directly engaged with those most targeted by the violence waged by ISIL. I've met with representatives of the Yazidi community in the United States a week after the Mount Sinjar attack, and just last week I met again with an Iraqi human rights group advocating for religious minorities. The State Department is in fact in regular communication with representatives of these communities in Iraq and in the United States, And that interchange has been vital in protecting vulnerable groups and getting humanitarian assistance directly to displaced community members. The Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM, is working to ensure humanitarian relief is reaching those in need, and it's provided $171.8 million thus far in fiscal year 2014 for aid to Iraqis both inside Iraq and in the region. ISIL's recent assault on northern and western Iraq is an extension of its brutal acts in Syria, where there have been reports of mass killings in Christian and Alawite villages, forced conversion at gunpoint, beheadings, kidnappings, and extreme abuse of women from all communities, including communities comprised of their fellow Sunni Muslims. In all of our engagements with Syrians, from Secretary Kerry down to the working level, we've consistently called upon all opposition parties to respect the rights of all Syrians, including the right to religious freedom, and to pursue a government and legal framework that protects these rights. Despite the challenges in realizing these goals, we've been heartened that the Syrian opposition coalition we have recognized has repeatedly and publicly denounced any affronts to religious freedom. Sadly, religious freedom violations are not limited to the dire situation in Iraq and Syria. In nearly every region of the world, we can see limitations on the freedom of exercise of religious freedom. In Pakistan, numerous religious minorities face high levels of violence and discrimination. Turkey refuses to recognize the Alevis' houses of worship, despite their 20% percentage of the population. And the Greek Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch continues to face restrictions as well. Pew Forum statistics highlight that over 80% of the world's population claims a religion, while over 70% of the global population lives in areas in which religious freedom is restricted. These statistics underscore the momentous step that the Congress took in 1998 when it passed landmark legislation, the International Religious Freedom Act, which sent a clear and strong signal that the universal right of religious freedom would be a priority of the United States foreign policy. We're deeply committed to our obligations under the IRF Act. We acknowledge the significant contributions toward implementation of the Act that have been made by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. On July 28th, Secretary Kerry released the 2013 International Religious Freedom Report, which describes the status of religious freedom in every corner of the globe. And at that time, he also announced his designations for countries of particular concern. This valuable tool highlights the most egregious violations, and we use this tool, among the many others outlined in the Act, to advance international religious freedom. And we press governments to stop violations when they happen, wherever they happen, and not only in countries of particular concern. Religious freedom, as well as the broader spectrum of human rights, remains a priority in U.S. foreign policy, and it's related more broadly to questions of governance and stability. Around the globe, in countries emerging from conflict or undergoing great change, like Burma and the Central African Republic, we find that fostering respect for religious freedom and a culture of tolerance is central to the creation of a just and lasting peace and a stable government. And this is a trend, I think, to which earlier witnesses have testified. As created by the 1998 IRF Act, the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom serves as the principal advisor to the Secretary of State and President on religious freedom. And just last week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing to consider the nomination of Rabbi David Saperstein. I understand that Rabbi Saperstein has now been voted out of Business Committee. He has a long and distinguished career pressing for international religious freedom, and we're hopeful for his speedy confirmation so that his efforts and energies can join in the important work already ongoing within the Department. The challenges of religious freedom around the globe far exceed the efforts of any one person. They require broad cooperation both inside and outside of government. My colleagues and I work with colleagues throughout the Department, our missions overseas, and the White House to ensure that the government is working together to advance religious freedom overseas. While we can never do enough, we continue to strive to meet our obligations under the IRF Act in both letter and in spirit. We appreciate Congress's support for international religious freedom, and we want to continue working closely with the legislative branch on our shared concerns and efforts to advance international religious freedom. I look forward to your questions and to our continued cooperation on this critical issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your participation. And we should refer to you as Dr. Sewell. We're going to change your nameplates out, and as long as I keep talking, the camera will probably stay on me, and they won't even notice it. So, Again, we thank you for your expertise and your passion on this issue. We heard previous testimony from our panelists that some want to see more of a stick approach. There should be more consequences for those that don't participate in religious freedoms. And we also heard from Mr. Smith, for instance, and others that said there ought to be some sort of incentives and rewards and some recognition for those that are actually moving in the right direction to encourage that types of behavior. What I see from afar is not much movement of the needle in the right direction. We hear some of the most horrific things you can possibly imagine, Boko Haram and what's going on there. We want to do something that's effective, that actually moves the needle. I think most Americans do care about this, and it does become the focal point of a lot of conflict around the world, in which our men and women, gets to a much more serious level. So, what, from your vantage point, actually works and that we need to do more of? What specifically do we need to do more of?
Well, as a former Sunday school teacher, I can confess that I share that desire to make our values promotion in the context of religious freedom, in the context of a broader human rights commitment, to be realized in a very practical level around the globe. And so I think I'd like to respond to your question in two different ways. First, I think one of the very clear realizations that we've had in the context of the ongoing conflict in both Syria and Iraq, and they're not new revelations, but they're really crystallized in the form of ISIL's rapid advance, is how central the question of religious freedom is to broader foreign policy questions and concerns that we have as a government. So I think one of the challenges for anyone who is passionately committed to the issue of religious freedom is to sometimes recognize where the issue is worked on with great fervor and commitment, even if the leading tag on the issue isn't religious freedom per se. In other words, I think we're hugely and deeply involved in promoting religious freedom in many aspects of our foreign policy that people don't necessarily think first and foremost as questions of religious freedom. And I think the ISIL frame, because of the brutality and the particular flavor of the evil that it perpetrates in the name of religion, has really raised that issue in a way that we haven't perhaps appreciated
But can you give me any example of something that we've done that's actually been effective?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Specific to this topic?
So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done that we think the United States can be extremely proud of. Active engagement by the administration in Armenia encouraged the passage of a law to protect conscientious objectors. That may sound like a small thing, but conscientious objectors in the past were not allowed to have a status. And so that's a significant and precedential example of a concrete impact from engagement. It led to the release of 28 Jehovah's Witnesses in the fall of 2013. We work with international partners to train law enforcement practitioners on tools to combat intolerance, discrimination, and violence on the basis of religion or beliefs, using methods that ensure respect for freedoms of speech and assembly. Those have effects that we don't necessarily track per se, but the training itself is very concrete, and it lives on in the commitment of those who carry it out. We have worked, for example, in the context of the current Egyptian government, where the prosecution of a few perpetrators of violence against religious minorities has occurred. That is obviously an insufficient response to the broader question of religious freedom in Egypt. Nonetheless, it has an important deterrent effect, and it demonstrates support for communities that we have long recognized as besieged in the context of Egypt's laws. Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab uprising, is a great example, I think, of how democracy can foster robust debates about how countries uphold fundamental rights. And again, the Constitution that was ratified in 2014 is not perfect, but I think we must be mindful and grateful for the strides that it takes in the Constitution for guaranteeing the liberty of conscious belief and worship. That's a significant change.
Okay, so this new position, I mean, it is bingo night over in the United States Senate, so who knows if we can get this person actually confirmed before they go into recess. It's good to see movement within the committee, but to have this position actually confirmed by the full United States Senate, I think we all share the concern that it takes way too long. What are you going to specifically do to make sure that that the rabbi is at the table and has a significant portfolio so that he can actually help move the ball forward? Part of the concern that we heard from the first panel is that, at least structurally on the organizational chart, is a little bit deeper into the bowels of the organization as opposed to a direct line of sight to the Secretary himself. So how do you deal with that as somebody within your organization?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Let me try to answer it in two different ways. I mean, first, I think in terms of the bowels of the bureaucracy, I would like to think of myself as having been bureaucracy-free for a good many years before I had the good fortune to be confirmed to join this administration. It is only through working within the State Department that I've come to appreciate the centrality that the bureaus themselves play in ensuring that the issues that they represent are folded across the entire State Department's work. In other words, I've come to believe and see in my daily practice the advantage of being inside a bureau. So, for example, whoever is the ambassador at large will have limits on his or her attention. What the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor can do is ensure that that person and that staff is integrated into the panoply of issues, whether they are the questions of government reform in Tunisia or in Iraq, or whether they are bilateral engagements with China or elsewhere. The reach of the ambassador at large is vastly magnified by being within DRL. And I've seen that in its manifestation. A great example of that, Mr. Chairman, would be the role that the Office of Religious Freedom was able to play in bringing information from the Yazidi community directly to the planners who were working on the military support, both the humanitarian support and the airstrikes, and the ability to lash up that expertise and specialized knowledge within the realm of a larger bureau that was centrally engaged in a broader range of issues, and then particularly manifest in the context of the conduct of the war. So I think it was a great example of how being within a bureau can magnify the impact of the ambassador at large.
Well, there is deep concern from a number of people to make sure that this position is fully implemented. I appreciate your commitment there. I don't doubt it. This position will be a newly filled position since you've taken and you had your confirmation. So we want to offer as much encouragement as we can to make sure that this person, hopefully will get Senate confirmation sooner rather than later, that they are fully integrated and have a place of prominence. I do think the points that were made earlier, that so many of our nation's conflicts are still rooted in some of the basic prohibitions that a lot of people have on the practice of religion. Some of this dates back thousands of years, and they're difficult emotional issues. But I think it's important to the United States of America. It's part of our success, and we want to make sure that it's given its full weight and measure. But I think now we'll recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I apologize I came in late, was delayed, but I certainly commend Chairman and Ranking Member for holding this hearing, and it's important hearing. I think everyone looks to the United States for leadership, particularly on moral issues, and we've sort of tried to set the pattern throughout our history as a nation that would protect human rights. You have an important position. How many people work with you in your office? Your title is Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. Dr. Sue? Can't hear you.
Excuse me. I'm so sorry, Congressman. My front office is, I believe, about 20 people, and the bureaus that live within the J Undersecretariat in cumulative total number roughly 2,000.
2,000 people work within?
Across 7 bureaus and offices.
Working to protect civilian security, democracy, and
we do counterterrorism work, sir. We do security sector reform.
I see, like civilian security
We do counterterrorism.
Is that like, I mean, we just lost two journalists, Mr. Foley and Mr. Sotloff. Would you be involved in those kind of cases too? They were held as hostages and slaughtered.
The Bureau of Counterterrorism is part of my mandate as the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human
So the 2,000 people that you oversee in that office have some of that responsibility. And then we're trying to get this nomination of Rabbi Saperstein to serve as the State Department's next ambassador at large for religious freedom. Now, has that position, how long has that position been vacant?
I believe it's been vacant for almost a year. We're very excited about the nomination of Rabbi Saperstein.
Now, does he report to you or someone else?
One of his first visits, I believe, was to my office, where he said, I need to know how important this issue is. And he was very vociferous in his desire
to... He would report to you. Is there another...
His office is based within the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He will...
Is there another secretary or deputy secretary position?
Yes, sir.
Between you and him?
He will be reporting to the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor.
Okay.
He will, of course, be able to report directly to the Secretary with any information, updates, or questions that he might have.
You would prepare protests, or you would, in cases where, like, civilians like Foley and Sotloff were slaughtered, do you prepare any human rights violation protests with, I guess, would that be directed where people say, we had a witness from was it Nigeria, who spoke of the slaughter of Christians there. If there are instances in where these violations or egregious slaughter of innocent people because of their religion or innocent civilians, you protest where? Is it the United Nations Human Rights Council?
Sir, our policy toward Nigeria has multiple dimensions, and many of the offices within my Undersecretariat, as well as the regional...
I think one of the witnesses said there was more slaughter of Christians in Nigeria than all the other instances.
Yeah, I was surprised by that number. I'll need to investigate.
But I'd be surprised if you were surprised if you're in charge of that.
Right. It might not be accurate. So we just need to investigate it.
Well, it sounds like a lot. But
it is a lot.
But
the slaughter by Boko Haram is horrific.
Yes. And my question is, you have a position, you just said you have 2,000 people that work for you, and we have some way to engage at the international community. Have we forwarded a protest from your department or the State Department of the United States within either the, I guess, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations? Have we done anything?
I would have to investigate whether we have
You don't know whether we...
I don't want to misspeak, Congressman.
No, I mean, I find it astounding,
so I need to be very careful.
I think that, I think that you should be aware, particularly where there's a slaughter of innocent civilians, be it media people or people for religious freedom, of what actions we're taking to
I would love to explain them to you.
Now, ISIS or ISIL might be a more difficult entity to come after because it's not a defined state, but certainly Nigeria is.
Would you like to know what we've done on behalf of our efforts against Boko Haram in Nigeria?
From you now, yes.
I could explain because I have been to Nigeria to raise these issues directly.
No, but it's not there, too. It's also to bring this to world attention, and this is the Department of State witness, Mr. Chairman, isn't it? We deal in these international bodies, we lodge protests, and someone in the State Department, secretary or someone has to initiate an action in a body, and that's we deal with other states. So My question is, what have we done?
We talked to other states
but we've not
repeatedly,
lodged anything or initiated.
I can repeat my answer. I'll need to check and find out whether or not we've
I
lodged
find it astounding, Mr. Chairman, that witness could come before us on an issue like that and not know if we've even lodged a protest in the appropriate international body. If there's some other international body you've protested to or taken action to, I'd like to know. For the record, maybe she could submit it. Thank you.
Be happy to
Now
do that.
recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member, and Mr. Tierney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Sewell, and thank you for your good wishes earlier on in your testimony. I understand that you're not the person that would be making any objections to international bodies and others. It's probably left to the Secretary on that basis. But please tell us what you have done, particularly with respect to Boko Haram and what actions you took in your position and capacity.
Thank you. Well, it's a team effort because the President has spoken directly to the President about his concern and ways in which we can help them defeat this scourge. We have been leaders with some of our closest NATO allies in trying to build a global coalition, or a regional coalition to defeat Boko Haram. We have had numerous regional meetings where we have sought to encourage the neighbors to increase their military activity as well as their information sharing. We have made significant inroads in helping the Nigerian government understand their need to be more responsive, not simply on a military level, but also in the context of addressing some of the grievances that exist in the Northeast. This is an issue that has been on the U.S. diplomatic radar screen and has been the focus of a wide range of meetings in different European capitals, in Nigeria. We have been sounding the alarm about Boko Haram. We have condemned its violence against all Nigerians, Christians, but also Muslims. And I think the First Lady's concern with the behavior of Boko Haram has been a great example of American values and engagement at work. And the notion that we have not been significantly, and it is our example of highlighting the abuses of this, of Shekau's really brutal campaign against all Nigerians has been front and center in our Nigeria policy and our engagement with allies and with others to try to highlight the difficulties that exist there now.
I think you started to indicate that you personally had taken a trip to Nigeria on that basis.
Yes,
would you relate to us what your impressions are of the responsiveness that you're getting from Nigerian officials when you make a presentation?
Thank you for that question. I would have to check on the date. I believe it was about 2 months ago when I went as part of a delegation. We were at the time concerned, and I testified before the House to convey our concern about the Nigerian government's recognition of the fundamental violations of human rights in northeast Nigeria, and in particular, their failure to mobilize effectively to confront the military threat of Boko Haram. I can tell you that a more recent delegation, which included my colleague at the State Department, Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas-Greenfield, just returned from Nigeria, where they reported that the Nigerian government, while now extremely concerned, has yet to be able to take effective action. And so we are in discussion now within the government about ways in which we might further encourage action both by Nigeria and by its neighbors, because the situation is extremely dire.
Do you think that Nigeria has the capacity?
I am concerned that Nigeria does not have the capacity, sir.
Thank you. All right. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of Nigeria and where you think we ought to go?
No.
To help build that capacity, for instance.
Well, there's a host of challenges in trying to work with Nigeria, not the least being, and this relates to the broader point that I was trying to make about how mainstream questions of religious tolerance are, because they are part of a question of governance and whether or not a government is responsive to its people and protects all of its human rights, to include the freedom of religion. I think that the protection of rights in the Northeast, or the attention to rights in the Northeast, has not been what it was, and that in turn allows for creates creates conditions in which it's easier for extremism of other forms to thrive. And so as we look to promote religious freedom, we can do so with the confidence that when we advocate our values overseas to foreign governments, we are actually advocating something that is, even though they may not see it in the short term, very much in their long-term interest, which is to promote tolerance and freedom and human rights as a state, so that they can hope to enjoy greater stability within the state. And it is a theme that we see not just in Nigeria, we see it also in Iraq and Syria, we see it in many places around the globe. And the fact that the United States is consistently raising freedom of religion and human rights in its engagements bilaterally, even with countries with whom we fundamentally disagree on a number of issues, I think speaks to its centrality in U.S. foreign policy, and the fact that while Rabbi David Saperstein will be an enormous boost, and we all hope for his speedy confirmation, and I, for one, am really looking forward to having him join the team in the State Department, this is work that goes on every day by many officials within the Department, and it is truly a central element of our foreign policy today.
Thank you, Doctor. Yield back.
Just a few more questions as we wrap up. You would acknowledge that Christians, at least at this time, are the most persecuted group around the world. Is that your belief?
I think Christians are extremely persecuted around the world.
Do you not agree that they're the most persecuted at this point?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, so it's hard for me to say that as a statistical matter, but I'm completely open to getting back to you with the numbers on that question, sir.
When would you get back to us with those numbers?
If the numbers exist, I'll be back to you later this afternoon.
Okay. I would hope that at your level, of your expertise, and you've got a number of things you're responsible for, that you would have those at your fingertips at any given time.
But, sir, I don't need the numbers to know that the persecution of Christians is wrong and should be an American foreign policy priority, as the persecution of all religious minorities is.
I would agree that what I don't see is any success.
Well, could I continue on that?
There are the host of materials and information and third-party groups, and we just heard testimony from a whole host of people who made, I think, a very solid point that what is happening or not happening in the State Department, it isn't working.
Well, I don't disagree, and I said in my testimony that we can never do enough to guarantee religious freedom any more than any other human right around the world. It is an uphill climb, but we are committed, and I think you'd be really interested in at least this set of facts. In the last few years, at least 100 people imprisoned for their faith have been released following USG advocacy in 8 countries in the Middle East, South and Central Asia, East Asia, and Africa. It's not an exhaustive list, but I know that we all long for some quantitative measure of impact, and I can at least with confidence give you that.
And I appreciate that. I look forward to having that and seeing that. I would also hope that you would be receptive to some of the other very worthwhile, credible outside groups who have done a host of this work and listened to their perspective as well. Let me ask you about one of the policy recommendations, and it seems simple to me that there would be or should be an annual designation. Is that something that off the top of your head is objectionable to annually try to evaluate and make some sort of designation? Is there any reason not to do that?
When I've asked the office about that issue, I get a very interesting answer, which is that they are constantly reviewing for designation. There is no minimum requirement or maximum requirement. They are constantly in that process. And so I think that as facts on the ground change and as the reviews continue, my understanding is that that is the basis on which they then designate, that it's not.
So it would be relatively easy if the Congress were to request something to just compile that what seems to be constantly in motion to have some sort of date or whatnot that we could get this annual designation. Is that fair?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So if Congress were to designate a date by which we try to do some sort of annual report, that shouldn't be extraordinary in terms of effort and something, if it's constantly in motion, to just simply take a snapshot in time.
Well, as you know, the administration has many reports that it is required to report. So
well, my understanding is that this year's designations were the first one, at least the staff is telling me, this year's were the first since 2011. So they're sporadic, at best, and we'll explore this with you. If there's other reasons, something that we're not thinking of, I'd appreciate if you'd share that with us. But it seems like a simple request. It would give us a good snapshot. It would remind us, and I think it would be important that, as was pointed out, the last thing you want to do is designate a country as somewhat problematic and not have them have the ability to climb off that list. And it should be just, in my personal opinion, much more than a list. There needs to be some sort of consequence. There needs to be some sort of reward, some sort of reason to move, move in the right direction. I guess that's the point. I have a host of other questions, but in the essence of what we're doing here in the time, I guess my last comment would be, we would certainly appreciate it in the future if we could have your participation and other people in the State Department on one panel rather than two panels. The opportunity to just share in the spirit of cooperation and understanding that we have one panel to share these things back and forth. I think we would find that we would be very bipartisan, and we may get to the point where we have to insist on that, but I appreciate your consideration to be able to have that on one panel. Be better use of the Congress's time, I think a better use of your time, and we would ultimately come up with a better product. And I'd appreciate it.
I suspect I'm entering a long history with regard to that issue. And
it has been back and forth, and I think we're going to have to be more insistent and in making sure that we have productive panels and that we have the good, candid dialogue. I know you're committed to what you do, and you're passionate what you do. You're very accomplished in your background. Appreciate the type of talent and thought that you bring to this. It's obviously a concern of ours that the religious liberties, religious freedoms become an integral part of the State Department's efforts and all of our foreign policy. It is very important. It should not be delegated to just one of those other things we need to check the box on, and that's I think the impression that we're trying to leave with you and with others. And I appreciate the good men and women who do work on this issue within the State Department and those in the outside groups who care passionately about these issues. And we thank all of you for your participation today. I think we learned a lot from this, and we got to make sure that we actually act upon it. So with that, we will stand adjourned. Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.